When somebody questions orthodoxy, they're normally dismissed as a heretic. But what if it's the orthodoxy that's contrary to God's will? Join us on Church Without Walls. I'm John, and we have somebody new to the show this week, apparently. I mean, I don't even recognize her. I don't know what happened to my daughter. Who are you?
I got my hair cut.
You got your hair cut?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to, kind of turn, let people see? Wow, you didn't mess around.
I got it cut a few days ago.
You went from one extreme to the other.
Yeah, it's a pixie cut.
It's a pixie. Rapunzel is now Pixie, and she joins us on Church Without Walls, and we'll check in on her, as she's starting her project on Payton Camp. But Church Without Walls, somebody called me this week and said I wasn't expecting what I would watch. Somebody recommended Church Without Walls to this person. He mentioned he watched several different pastors online, and I guess he might have been expecting 3 points of poem or prayer. So I guess I should every now and then kind of explain Church Without Walls. So real briefly, this is just a guy in his living room. I'm not a pastor anymore. I'm not pastoring a church. I pastored for 20 years. It's just a guy welcoming you into his living room. I'd like to brag about Christ, but to talk about some things that maybe you've heard or maybe they've been dismissed by religion or the church. And it's a chance to look at things from a different perspective and maybe shed some light where there's only been heat, and challenge our preconceptions, including my own. And so I welcome you into my living room, and Payton welcomes you, and we're here every week, and we do run a ministry called the Sparrow's Call, which we could talk about later, but that's meant for people who've been harmed by the church or who've left it, who are going through deconstruction, often referred to as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the duns, or the seekers. Flexible, kind of a fluid group of people who don't see Christ through the forest of Christianity. And so we're trying to, I guess, remove some of the debris, trim some of the branches, and give people an unobstructed view of the true Christ and not the ventriloquist dummy that oftentimes religion makes of Jesus. And so that's the Sparrow's Call. I want to start with something that was fascinating that my mother did for me. And it was when I was, I was as extreme as Payton as a young man, and I had long hair, and I was a rock and roller, and I played bass guitar. And the only music in the world really was rock and roll and the blues. And my mom loved a variety of music. I mean, you could hear the Platters in our house while she was ironing, or Nat King Cole. You'd hear, hymns from Moody Bible Institute. You'd hear all classical music. She loved classical music. And so she tried to give me an education that there's music beyond the power chord and the indulgent guitar solo. And she couldn't find a way in. She'd try and put on a record, and I had ADD, musical ADD. I just didn't give it a chance until one day she said, "Why don't you watch this movie with me?" And now that's my love language. I love watching movies, and this was difficult for my mother because she grew up in a very kind of strict Baptist background where movies were, of course, of the devil. And so we didn't go to a movie, but somewhere between the movie theater and the VCR, movies got sanctified or cleansed by the Holy Spirit, and so you weren't like committing a mortal sin if you weren't sitting in a theater. So anyway, we sat in my mother's living room, and she popped in. The kids watching don't know what a VCR is. It's kind of like an ancient DVD player, which you probably don't know what a DVD player is either. But she slipped in. I don't know if we rented it or if we eventually bought it, but she slipped in a VHS tape into the VCR, and we watched Amadeus, which is kind of a biography, loose biography of this wonderful figure, Amadeus Wolfgang Mozart. And I was entranced, and that was the way in for me. I fell in love with classical music, and my mom and I were able to share the depth of that love together, because this movie opened my mind to something outside of the Who and Led Zeppelin. And so our story starts today in my living room with a magical story about Mozart and the church, which normally aren't put together. Normally people talk about Bach or Handel. But this is a story about Mozart and the church, and I think it teaches us a really valuable lesson. Sometime in the early 17th century, a priest who had a very, many of the great hymns that we still cherish today, and many of the great musical pieces in church history, in church music, were really composed by priests. There wasn't like a separate category where people handed out dove awards to Christian musicians. It was the priesthood that really composed a lot of the lyrics and even the music of the early stuff. So early 17th century, 1620, 1630, Gregorio Allegri composed this wonderful piece, Miserere me du. And the church, he was a Catholic priest, the church was so enamored of it, they decided, in their wisdom, to keep it secret. So the only place you could hear it performed is in the Sistine Chapel. And this worked for 150 years. For 150 years, if you wanted to hear that piece performed, you had to go on a pilgrimage to Rome and go into the Sistine Chapel and hear it performed. And one day, a father took his 14-year-old in to hear it. And the 14-year-old heard it twice and went home and transcribed it from memory, freeing this piece that had been in bondage to the church for 150 years. Obviously, his name was Mozart. Now, I just want to give you a taste of this piece to kind of appreciate it in its glory. And here it is. Now, this probably sounds familiar to you, right? You've probably heard it at points in a movie score where they're trying to, create a mood, right? And you didn't really know that it had that historical background and that it took Mozart to bring it to the world. But I want to talk for a moment about how this took place, how this whole thing happened, that the church would take something so beautiful and put a boundary around it, fortify it, from the profane world outside. And see, I think that was the attitude of orthodoxy during this period of church history. This idea that the world was a profane place and that we had to safeguard the sacred, like it was protecting the Holy Grail, right, from the masses of the unwashed. So the Knights Templar, right, at the tip of the spear, would make the sacred exclusive. And I just want to say how strange this is from a religion whose founder instructed us all to go into the world making disciples, instructed us to take the words that we heard from him and announce them from the rooftops. A religion, if you will, that told us as approved laborers, right, we should be ready to give any man and every man an answer for the hope that is within us. Now, I would think that that would not just include some kind of stale, dry, apologetic argument, but Christian art. You know, the whole kind of thing that we're told really in both testaments, that the disciple, the adherent, the devotee of the true faith is with heart and mind and soul and strength to honor God in all that we do with every fiber of our being. And yet somehow we divorced ourselves from the world. Now, this isn't something that ended with Mozart, right? This is something that still happens today. We surround our little cultic corners with armed guards. We turn our faith into a tribalism or to an otherism, where there's us and then there's them. One of the questions I received is probably a question you've heard a lot of times on the internet or whatever. I got a couple questions this week, which I'll be taking up over the next few weeks. But one of them was, you know, what do I say to the Jehovah's Witness at my front door? So I love that question, because if you Google it or YouTube it, you're going to find a lot of combative answers. They're all combative answers. Every answer you receive to that question is how to defeat an opponent in 4 moves, like it's a chess opponent that comes to your door. And Christianity is to show you how to do a 4-move checkmate. You want to get the person in checkmate. And so it's teaching you an easy checkmate, right? And, you know, I was a pastor's son, and I was a pastor for 20 years. So I would get this question oftentimes. And my father before me he'd get a phone call. And it would be from somebody who goes to our church and who would say, oh, the Jehovah's Witness next door is coming over in about 5 minutes. What do I say? You know, kind of like, is there a cheat sheet I can have so I could pin him or her and make them tap out? And there's some magical words that will work like an elixir, like kind of like I'm a warlock. And if I say these magical words out of my book of enchantments, they're magically gonna call on the name of the Lord and bow on bended knee in a puddle of tears and accept the Lord Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. So you'd get this call and, oh, so-and-so's coming over in 5 minutes. Can you give me the cheat sheet? And they're desperate. They're desperate because they've been brought up in a background that wants to pin opponents and that wants to checkmate somebody as quick as possible, to disarm them as if it was a sword fight, and we all want to be Zorro. Never think about what it takes to be Zorro, the hours of practice, the understanding of the sword in your hand till it's an extension of your arm, that kind of thing. But we all want to put it in a combative sense, that we need a sword or a kill move, right? To put it in the Xbox terms, a special kill move that's unique to us. So Pastor, help me deal with the Jehovah's Witness that's coming over in 5 minutes. Everything you Google on YouTube, it's the 4-move checkmate. Here's how you check. Here's their weaknesses. Here's how you exploit their weaknesses. And it might not work because they might be, obstinate and not flexible, and they might even be demon possessed. But here's what you try. It's proven. It's the best way to combat the Jehovah's Witness at your door. And you get this in various ways. You get it with Muslims, you get it with others. So one of the other questions I got this week is, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Which is another question that is, well, did you ever have that humanities teacher who was really likable? Everyone in the school always loves the humanities teacher. And he's easygoing, and he's kind of some version of Stuart Smalley, right? Where he sees the good in everybody, and he might have said to you in class, there's no stupid questions. I can assure you there are stupid questions. But the way in which he said it, he's right. He would be right, that there are no stupid questions for a student to ask a teacher if you're learning, to get out of ignorance somehow, right? But I can assure you, if you've studied Jesus and Socrates, there are stupid questions. So let me define this. And I'm not saying Jesus and Socrates asked them. I'm saying they didn't answer them. So the stupid question is a question that's not looking for information, but that's looking for a checkmate or a pin, or it's a trap question. And so oftentimes Jesus would be asked trap questions by people trying to trip him up. That's a stupid question. And it's not stupid because the person asking the question is stupid. Actually, the person asking the question is crafty and wily and maybe very knowledgeable, maybe a bit vile. Because he's got an agenda going on that's, under the waves that you can't see. It's an underground current. And in the case of Jesus, it was always trying to trip him up, get him in trouble so we could stone him or crucify him, right? And so the stupid part of the question doesn't come with the question. The stupid part comes with the answer. If you're dumb enough to put your foot into the snare, into the bear trap, if you're dumb enough to take the bait because the worm looks really good on the on the hook. So the stupid part comes in not with the person posing the question, but with the person who's sometimes more than willing to answer it. And this is why oftentimes you see Socrates and Christ and others, men like C.S. Lewis, weigh the legitimacy of not just the question, but the questioner before rendering pearls before what could be swine. And that's where that whole thing plays in. So this question about, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? I always love this because it reveals something to me about the person asking it. And I'm sorry, I know the person asking it this week wasn't really asking it. They were asking, what do you say when you're asked this? Because they've been asked this. So please don't take this as a critique of you. But usually this is somebody who's insecure in their faith. They're insecure in their Christian faith, and they feel that they've got to beat up on Muslims or Mormons or in some cases Catholics or Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists to be able to prove that our dad could beat up your dad, on the playground. And so they want a Perry Mason moment where you stand up and you get, well, Perry Mason didn't do this, but oftentimes the person he opposed would do it. They want a moment where somebody loses it, right? Where somebody gets angry, or they want the Jesus movement where he walks into the temple and he overturns the tables of the money changers, and that's their whole religion. That's the whole reason that they follow Jesus is for that one moment. They don't like the tender Jesus with the Samaritan. They don't like the Jesus who forgives sins, and they want the Jesus who could lead a Tea Party movement or overturn the tables of the liberals or something. This is the Jesus. They want the muscle-bound Jesus, with the whip. And so they want the answer to crush the Muslims, right? And of course, we don't worship the same God. They worship a demon, and we don't. We worship the one true God. And so the question, and I'm going to take this maybe next week. Maybe I'll take this one next week because I just love it. It's just so filled with lessons, right? The real question is, before we get to the question, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? You have to ask yourself, do Christians and Christians worship the same God? You might have to chew on that for a second. Do Christians and Christians worship the same God? Now, before we go there, let's take it back to the Old Testament. And did Jews worship the same God? Because oftentimes you heard the prophets say, you offer sacrifices and prayers to God, but he didn't ask for them and he won't accept them because you're full of it, right? It's all a show. And then you had, when Jesus actually came, he said, you don't love the Father. If you love the Father, you'd love me. These were Jews he was saying this to. These were people in his faith, in his religion. The religion he upheld, the law that he came to fulfill, right? So he'd say, you say you love Abraham and Moses and the Father, but you don't. And you're of your father, the devil. So did Jews worship the same God? Paul goes on to write in Romans that not everyone of Israel is of Israel. So you have this divide actually within Judaism, and it's no different in Christianity. Later, Paul would write to the Galatians, there are some who worship another and different Jesus, and this isn't Jesus. And you have Matthew writing that at the judgment, at a particular judgment, people would be saying to Jesus, Lord, Lord, we did all this in your name. And he'd say, I never knew you. So my question, before we ever get to Christians and Muslims, is, do Christians and Christians worship the same God? See, that's uncomfortable because we don't want to think along those lines. And yet some people are confident with saying, no. Actually, anyone outside of my little corner of the room doesn't really worship the true Jesus, right? Only we do it right, because we, sprinkle and don't dunk, or we wait till the person's an adult and could choose for himself and not a baby. There's all these different factions and divisions and ways and places where we can find division. And so how does Mozart help us with all this, right? Mozart was a reformer. I want you to think about this. So for 150 years, the church hid the beauty of Allegri's piece for a select few, because they viewed the outside world as profane and I guess not worthy of the beauty of a prayer offered up to God. It's just mind-blowing. Mind-blowing, right? And yet it took a 14-year-old, some think he was on the spectrum, probably was autistic because of his incredible capacity, for mathematics, for music, right? And there's that wonderful scene in Amadeus where Mozart's wife takes some of his work to Salieri, and Salieri's looking at it, and he said, these are the copies. Can I keep these copies? And she says, no, I got to take them back. These aren't copies. These are originals. And he didn't believe her. And the reason he didn't believe her is because there were no erase marks, right? It looked like it had been copied from something that was already finished. And he said, but there's no erase marks. And she said, well, he doesn't erase anything. It's all in his head, and he puts it down. And Salieri couldn't fathom this, right? This kind of like Rain Man prodigy with music, and this is Mozart. So 14, he walks out of that church, and he steals, like Prometheus, fire from the gods, and gives it to us. Something that Luther would later try. But the thing about theologians doing it is they end up dividing the church. So the reformers did a lot of deforming, right? They didn't really bring us together. It drove us further apart. And so it wasn't just now that there was one church and now there's two. It was that there was, a following that maybe had been corrupted, right? And I know the term reform means not start something new, but fix what's broken. So it started that way, but it ended up splintering into hundreds and thousands of different splinters. And don't think the devil didn't have a hand in that. Now, I'm not saying that Luther was inspired by the devil. I'm saying the devil doesn't give up any battlefield, right? He's trying to influence in every place. The adversary, if you don't believe in a devil, stay with me, don't tune out. I'm not Pat Robertson. I'm just saying the adversarial role against what God is trying to do is real, and it's there. And whether you call it entropy or Satan, it's there, and it's active, and it's powerful, and it's the rust on every metal, right? It's the dust in every room. It's there, and it's going to oppose every cause with an equal and opposite effect. And so here you have Mozart, and I don't think he had a motivation of saying, "Oh, this is too beautiful to keep just in this room. Let's give it to the world for Christ." I just think he was reacting out of his capacity. He couldn't help himself. But I'm so glad he did it. But what can we learn from that? How much of what we have today do we keep cloistered? Do we keep away from the very people that God would want us inspired to introduce it to take it to say, look at this flower. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I borrow your flowers? It's a perfect metaphor. Look at this flower. These are Payton's flowers. Don't they smell amazing? Don't they look amazing? Isn't it beautiful? So how much of our church life is a monastery, is something that we keep enclosed and we hide under a bushel, right? So I don't be entranced with an orthodoxy. We're going to look at some challenging things. If there's one thing we do here at the Church Without Walls, it's challenge the norm in whatever stands. It's what Paul says in Corinthians. The holy fire is going to burn through the town, right? And whatever is wood, chaff, and stubble, it's going to be cleared away. Like the healthy part of a fire that clears away the old debris so new things can sprout up. And so the fire that consumes the chaff also refines the metal. And so it's got not just the property of this fire is not just one that reduces waste to ash, but it makes something more precious. It makes something that's lasting more precious. And this is what your prayer should be about the Holy Spirit in your life. Burn me. Father, put me into the flame. I want to be a right Jerusalem blade in your hand. There I go using the language of combat again. But I think you understand the point, we want to be a metal that's forged in the flame, or gold where the dross is burned away. But a lot of times we're held captive because we've grown up in a system that's cloistered and that believes it's doing the right thing for God. We talked a moment ago about, do Jews worship the same God as other Jews? And clearly they hadn't, right? C.S. Lewis writes himself about the hard determinists, and he says of them that those that believe that God determines everything, including evil, including, rape and the murder of the young and all everything in the world. The people who believe that about God, whether you call them Calvinists or hard determinists, they're not worshiping the same God as we are. They're worshiping an omnipotent fiend. Now, he says it in a kinder way than I just did, so as not to offend everyone in the room, but he's still making that point. People who call themselves Christian might not be worshiping the same God. Then, in probably the most bold piece of literature that he wrote, which people are really uncomfortable with, called The Last Battle. You remember The Last Battle, right, Pay? We did it. The Narnia. It's the wrap-up. It's book 7 in the Narnia series. And in The Last Battle, there's this character named Emeth. And Emeth is a Calormene in the book, which I'm going to translate the book into like what the modern reality would be. So let's just say Emeth, which by the way is a Hebrew word for truth, firmness, solidity. Emeth would be like if he was in our world and not in Narnia. Emeth would have been a Muslim who worshipped Allah. In the book, he's a Calormene who worshipped this god named Tash, who actually turns out to be a demon in the end. But in our world, he would be a Muslim worshiping Allah. And in The Last Battle, the characters all have to pass through this barn, if you will. I think there's characters in the book that even refer to it, in terms like a stable. So it's a stable, like what Christ was born in. But so the characters pass through this, and I hope I'm not ruining this for you. I'm inspiring you to read it. But the Narnian characters that followed Aslan, they end up in Aslan's country, which is like heaven, right? And they encounter Emeth there. Emeth is there, right? This follower of Tash. And there's a little exchange, and they talk, and they're surprised that Emeth is there because he worshipped Tash. And Emeth tells his story, and he tells his story how when he came into the stable, he was confronted with Aslan the lion. And during his life, he thought Aslan was the demon, and he worshipped Tash. But he worshipped Tash, and the character of Tash, which was the true character of Aslan. He really thought that he worshipped a name, had a different name, but basically the god he worshipped was the true God. And Aslan explains this to him. He said, you thought you were worshiping Tash, but Tash didn't have the capacity for that kind of thing. And everything you did that was right and honorable can only be done to me, even if you don't recognize my name. And anything that's done in the name of Tash can only be vile. And so Aslan has this conversation with him, and he allows Emeth into Aslan's country, even though Emeth didn't know the right name for God. And people lost their minds over this. They're saying, oh, C.S. Lewis is a universalist, or he believes all roads lead to heaven. And he didn't, because Tash and Aslan were not equal. And yet he gives Aslan this attribute, right, that we understand of God, that he's just, that he is the most just judge there is. And when confronted with somebody who didn't have the capacity or the background to understand the deeper things of Aslan. And by the way, so Lewis's argument here, and we'll take this up in a further week, I'm getting sidetracked, but Lewis's argument here is not based on Lewis's own feelings. It's based on Romans 1 and 2, what Paul writes in Romans 1 about everyone having, the law written on their heart, the consciousness of God given to them on their heart, apart from a book, apart from a missionary, apart from a pastor, apart from Sunday school. Whether or not you ever heard of Jesus Christ or stepped foot into a church, everyone born of woman, every son of Adam and daughter of Eve, has a God consciousness imprinted on their heart that seeks with a magnetic pull, with a gravitational pull toward the sun, S-O-N. And in Romans 2, Paul talks about Gentiles who never heard the law or apart from the law had the law written on their heart. And when they responded to it, God was good with that. Fascinating. So anyway, before we ask the really silly questions about, how to checkmate the Jehovah's Witness coming to my door, you want my answer to that in short? It's be Daryl Davis. And you can't be Daryl Davis in 5 minutes. And think about how you would feel if you came to somebody's door and you wanted to talk to them. They dismissed you with a tract or a book or some sermon on tape, or they threw some Bible verses at you and treated you like a mosquito that needed to be, slapped. Daryl Davis he's a black man, he's led 200 people out of the Ku Klux Klan, not by pinning them with a 4-move checkmate, not by knowing the right Bible verse to inject into an opening conversation. He loves them. He first treats them like human beings because they have been harmed, human beings who need healing and need love. And it's the love and the respect of Daryl Davis that opens the hearts of these men and women to accept Daryl as a human being, as a fellow human being, and eventually as a brother, and leads them out of darkness into light. So, my answer for what to do with the Jehovah's Witness at your door is a lot more complicated than a 4-move checkmate, than take them to John chapter 1. You actually have to look at them not as Jehovah's Witnesses. You have to look at them as someone who is a special creation of God, somebody who God desires to come home. This is the brother whom you are to be a keeper. You are your brother's keeper, right? You have a chance to be Cain here, or to be the father in the story, the prodigal son, right? So here we are. What's the hard and the simple answer? The hard and the simple answer is love them, look at them as human beings who God loves, God desires, Christ died for, and wants you to intercede with. And that takes a greater investment than watching some apologist on YouTube tell you for an hour a bunch of proof texts you can use to clobber them. And yet that apologist who tells you for an hour how to clobber the Jehovah's Witness next door has hundreds of thousands of views, because we want to destroy our enemy or to dethrone our enemy or to convict our enemy instead of loving our enemy. And the biblical approach is much more Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was confronted by one of his cabinet members. I think it was his Secretary of Defense, and he was so frustrated at Lincoln's attitude towards his political adversaries. And he says, you got to stop, treating these guys like they're your friends. They're not your friends. We have to destroy them, right? And Lincoln said to this guy, because he was inspired by the life and the words of Christ, Lincoln said to him, when my enemy becomes my friend, haven't I destroyed my enemy? That's not an easy thing to do. That's going to cost you skin and time and energy and commitment And to love anyone is to be vulnerable, because you might be hurt. You might be hurt. You will be hurt if you love enough people long enough with the heart of Christ. No sugarcoating it. You will be hurt. Now, let's check in on Payton, Cam. I don't want to be, oh, it looks like it's coming along great. Wow, I can't wait to get to that. We're going to get to that real shortly. But here, if you love anybody, especially an enemy, do you think that comes with no cost? You think loving a neighbor comes with no cost? What about when that neighbor's an enemy? This is why Nietzsche couldn't stomach the New Testament. He didn't want to love his enemies. How crazy is it to offer your cheek to somebody who's just bloodied one side of your face? How weak is it to offer your coat too to somebody who sued you for your shirt? How pathetic is it to be forced to carry somebody's burden, a Roman soldier's pack for a mile, and then to carry it an extra mile? You see, this is an abstract view of human relationships. What Christ presented to the world was so revolutionary and so different, where he's presenting himself as a living sacrifice and asking us to do the same. But he's not a pincushion. He's not saying, be a martyr. You might become a martyr, but he's not saying that that's your mission. He's not saying you should be a punching bag, or, what is that we put in front of our doors where people could wipe off the mud before coming in, this doormat. He's not asking you to do that. That's not the goal in mind. He's asking you to look at your oppressor and redeem them. Become greater to them. It's not to be lesser than them. The person who redeems their oppressor is not lesser, but is greater. But it comes with a cost. It came with a cost for our Lord, for those followers of our Lord. And it doesn't do us any good to try and sugarcoat it and say that Christianity is easy. It's not. As Chesterton said, the thing about Christianity isn't that, he said it's not that Christianity hasn't been tried. I'm butchering this quote, but he said it hasn't been tried because it's not easy. It's not easy. Lewis wrote, if I wanted a religion to be comfortable, I'd never pick Christianity. A bottle of port would do that. Christianity is not a comfortable religion. If you're comfortable in it, you're not doing it. Seriously. And, it's not like you're to go through life miserable. I mean, there's a joy in this kind of a lifestyle, because you start to recognize the important and the unimportant. And the worst thing in life, I think, is to be caught up in pride. And so humility is a place where real growth and healing takes place, and real empathy can come across, and real love can take root. And pride ruins everything. Pride ruins families, it ruins relationships, it breaks up marriages, alienates children from parents, it splits churches. I've seen that a dozen times. It turns neighbor against neighbor. One of the negative things is when you have people that have the same name as you. A fellow has the same name as me. We're not related. I mean, maybe distantly related. And he's just a firebrand on social media, and he writes all these crazy things. And sometimes it affects me because people think I'm him. So I wrote to him the other day because he basically told half of America to, kiss off because they're of a different political flavor. And he was basically saying he's sick of America being divided by politics, and the guys over there are doing it. So damn them all to hell. And so I wrote to him, I said, do you realize what you just did there? You just told half of America and half of your friends list and maybe half of your family members to go to hell. How is that accomplishing your goal? And I mean, this is the world we live in. But so over the next few weeks, and if you watch this, you might be uncomfortable at times because I might have challenged something that you hold dear, something you learned in Sunday school, or something that you've grown up with in your church and you felt was an element of the Christian faith, and you're solid with it, and maybe you haven't thought about it in the ways that I'm going to present. And you might take it the wrong way. You might take it as me attacking orthodoxy. No, I'm trying to be Mozart in that case. And so I might be wrong. That's the thing. I could be wrong. I have been wrong before. And I've gained a great deal of, I think, personal growth by examining my own views and asking the question, what if I'm wrong? And so that's what I'm going to ask you to do. You might not be wrong. You might be right. But there's nothing scary because truth doesn't fear scrutiny. So if you scrutinize your own viewpoints, there's only blessing can come from it. Either you held the wrong viewpoint, and by scrutinizing it, you've realized that you have a piece of lettuce in your teeth because you've looked at the mirror and you see it now. I've got a piece of lettuce in my teeth, or my fly is open. You want to zip it up. I mean, this is a good thing. This is something the truth does. It might be humiliating in the moment, right? But what's more humiliating, to fix an error that you've carried around for a while, or to continue smiling with the lettuce in your teeth and nobody there is kind enough to tell you, put an arm around you and say, hey, John, come here. You might want to. So what can happen by scrutinizing your own views, right? You find out that you've been wrong and you can correct it. And that's a wonderful thing. That's not something we should be embarrassed about. We're human, right? Certainty isn't the opposite of faith. Certainty is a psychological crutch for the insecure. So, I should say doubt isn't the opposite of the faith. Certainty is. So it's contrary to faith. That's what I meant to say. But anyway, what can happen if we examine our own views and ask the question, what if I'm wrong? And, what if so-and-so is right? Well, you can find out you are wrong. That's a positive thing for people who want to grow, right? You don't want to keep going down the wrong path because you're getting further and further away from your goal, right? I mean, what's better? The proud person doesn't stop and ask for directions, right? We've all been in that situation. The proud person doesn't stop at the gas station because their wife is frustrated. We don't have a map and GPS, and she's certain we're going the wrong way. And damn it, we're going to get there. So we don't stop for directions. And you end up hours out of your way with more egg on your face when you finally do. So we should want to know if we're on the wrong path. We should want a GPS to help us with, no matter where that help comes from. If we stop at a gas station and the attendant is rude, so what? Now we're saving time. We're actually better for it. So Epictetus, if you will, used to say, if somebody criticizes you, don't get angry. He says, first, ask if the criticism is true. And if it's true, then alter your behavior, because you should take this, even if it's from an enemy, even if the criticism is for an enemy, it's a blessing to you, because now you're better for it. And if it's not true, if it's just something somebody said to be mean, laugh it off, because it's not true. You don't have to carry the baggage. So if we examine our own views and we find out we're wrong, we're in a better place if we're humble. Not everyone's humble, and that creates a whole mess of problems. But what if we're right? What if we're confirmed in our view? Well, now we've examined it from different angles. So when that comes up in conversation, or when somebody else is in error, has the lettuce in their tooth, we're able to help them. We're able to show them because we've actually walked in their shoes there. We've actually been to that corner of the neighborhood and said, no, I know when you come to that fork in the road, you went right. That's why you ended up there and not here. And at Big Oak Tree, you're supposed to go left. Here's how I know that. I've been right. Right? So if you're right, you're stronger in your view because you've examined all the weaknesses, the apparent weaknesses of it, and you're able to dismiss those weaknesses logically, right? And be able to be tender with those who are wrong in those views. We're coming to you in a second, Pay. So there you are. I mean, truth doesn't fear scrutiny. If you land in a place where you examine your own views, or your church's views, or your religion's views, or your, the faith that you've held since a kid in Sunday school, if you've made something sacred that isn't, how miserable are you in that? Paul actually even said, if Christ is not risen, we are the most miserable of all men. Now, that's a bold statement. He was even willing to examine his view on the resurrection, although he personally recognized that Christ had risen. He had seen the risen and glorified Christ. Well, more on this later in the week, but I'd like you to contemplate what Mozart did there, not just what Mozart did as the first reformer. This is our friends over at the Beethoven Society. Our friends over at the Beethoven Society said this about what Mozart did. In the 1630s, there was a song only played in the Sistine Chapel. The Vatican kept the composition of Miserere Mei secret for 150 years until 14-year-old Mozart listened to it twice, transcribed it from memory, and produced the first unauthorized copy. This is one of the earliest records of musical piracy. Well, they're looking at it musically, but I'm looking at it as a matter of reformation of a false orthodoxy, of actually worshiping God in the way he should be worshipped, by opening the cage and letting the holy dove fly out, right? And it was unauthorized. And some of the greatest things done in the world in worship and for Christ and for our fellow men have not been authorized by the church. Now keep that in mind, because every generation thinks they're right and the previous generation was in darkness. And true wisdom would allow us to realize that there's going to be a percentage of this generation that was not inspired by God and that was carried forward as orthodoxy that wasn't, that was chaff, that was tares and not wheat. And it takes a humble person to look at what they've got, on the table in front of them and say, what doesn't belong? What feels out of character to the person and the words of Jesus Christ? And allow the holy fire to purge it away. All right, I want to go to Payton now. That looks amazing. Lots of color today. You've moved from sculpture back to a crayon piece in colored wax. What can you tell us about this?
Well, here's a fairy with a flower hat. And here's another fairy playing a flute. And this fairy is playing a ukulele. And then this fairy is sitting down on a stool. And then this is a pool noodle. And this is a pool donut. And this is a pool floaty.
Are they in a lazy river?
Yeah, they're in a lake.
Oh, a lake, a lazy lake.
Uh-huh. And this is a giant flower, and right here is a butterfly.
And somebody's in the shade of that giant flower.
Yeah.
That's where I'd be reading a book. But nobody's reading a Kindle or a book, so I'm not sure your fairies...
This one is, relaxing, but the rest of them are playing instruments.
They're playing instruments. Oh, music.
This one has a flute, and this one has a ukulele.
Maybe they're playing Miserere.
Maybe.
Folks, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Oh, by the way, please like our YouTube channel, like and subscribe. I'm not a self-promoter, but you won't miss anything that we do then. People have been writing me, how do we get to, if you watch us on YouTube, or if you go to YouTube and look at Sparrow's Call, look for Sparrow's Call, or if you find us on Facebook, or if you just go to sparrowscall.org, you can go to our YouTube channel through there and hit the bell or whatever, I don't know, the like and the subscribe button, so that when we put together a new video, because we're doing some during the week now. Our latest one is an interview with biologist Dr. Dennis Venema, and he talks about all kinds of things about the intersection of faith and science and how sometimes that could be a stumbling block, but they don't need to be. And we're going to release later today the full interview with Dr. Venema, and it's called Reconcilable Differences, right? The place at the table for faith and science. So if you like and subscribe, you won't miss anything. So please go like and subscribe. It helps us out. It allows other people to see what we're doing, maybe to join us next week. Thanks for coming, folks. We'll see you. What do you think, Paul?
Good. I think this is one of my favorite pictures yet.